Hi friends, welcome to my channel. In the last program, we talked about the origin of Sumerians. A link to that program there is in the description of this video. Now, we'll continue with the Sumerians, and I'll tell you about the most important Sumerian inventions. A new form of government that the ancient Greeks called despotism, and the origin of the deep state. The word despotism comes from the Greek word despotis, which means a master who ruled in a household. This form of government is one in which not people are the owners of the country, but the country and the people themselves are the property of some rulers. Let's take a look at how this form of government was step by step created in Mesopotamia. In the 5th millennium BC, Mesopotamia had a traditional communal society. There is no evidence of an isolated elite during that period. The main social unit of such a society was a community consisting of equal members, governed by elder, and owning all the land necessary for life. Such communities often formed into larger communities governed by a council of elders and elected leaders. As it was customary in ancient times, after joining the community members choose one of the gods as their heavenly patron. God's task was considered to promote the prosperity of the community and save it from all kinds of disasters. And people in return pledged to honor their heavenly patron, making sacrifices to him and performing all the necessary rituals. That is, relating to the gods was then purely practical. The newly formed community usually established its own local center. This center was fortified and served as a place of common assembly, and as a place where, in case of war, the members of community could find safer shelter than in the villages. It's important to note that the natural conditions in Mesopotamia are very difficult. On the one hand, there is a very fertile soil, which, with irrigation, produces large harvests. On the other hand, there are often unpredictable floods that can not only wash away all crops from the fields, but also completely destroy all settlements. Therefore, in order to protect people and property from flooding, elevated places were needed that would not be inundated with water during floods. For this reason, the construction of artificial platforms began, on which all the necessary supplies were placed inaccessible to water. Also, the temples of the patron gods were built on the same platforms. Later, these platforms evolved into huge ziggurat temples. To perform rituals and interact with the gods, priests were chosen from among the community members, whose qualities best suited such activities. And then, at some point, priesthood positions were no longer elective, and the priesthood became a separate caste with hereditary knowledge and titles. We don't know why this happened. Most likely, they were able to convince the people that special knowledge was necessary for a successful relationship with the gods, and only they had this knowledge. But the fact is that by the end of the 4th millennium BC, this caste of priests had already been formed, and the priests had a very great influence on society. At this time, already were built the food storage platforms. On these platforms, already were built the temples of the gods, and the priesthood already was an isolated caste. As a result, a system developed in which farmers who didn't want to lose their grain in the event of a flood would deposit it in the temple and then receive grain for sowing and subsistence. This system required record keeping, which led to the creation of the first pictographic writing, considered one of the most important achievements of the Sumerian civilization. All the records were kept on clay tablets by the priests, and since they had control over public property, they further strengthened their influence on society. And then the most interesting part started. The priest caste, slowly but surely, began to take power in the communities. The first step was the imposition of a fee for the storage of grain in the temple complex. So, if a farmer deposited 10 measures of grain in the temple, he would get back only 9 measures, and 1 measure would go to the temple. We don't know how this decision was pushed through in the People's Assembly. Most likely, this fee was presented as a sacrifice to the god. And as a result, the temples began to receive teeth from the income of each member of the communities. And at some point, they became the owners of vast capital, which at the time was calculated in grain. Grain was the main currency. It was used to pay for the labor of hired laborers and hired warriors to form the temple squads. After some time, for the sake of simplicity, silver was used in addition to grain, and a fixed exchange rate was established between it and grain. This was the origin of money, the second great invention of the Sumerian civilization. Despite the fact that the temple grain was used to pay the labor of many workers and warriors, the temples still had a surplus of it, and the priests quickly figured out how to put it to profitable use. They began to lend this grain at a percentage to farmers in need of grain. This was then the third great invention of Sumerian civilization: usury and bank interest. Farmers could now receive grain for planting with the promise to return it with interest after harvest. The interest rate on such a grain loan ranged from 1/3 to 1/2 of the principal amount. Thus, a farmer who borrowed 10 measures of grain for planting would have to return 13 or 15 measures to the temple after the harvest. The introduction of these grain loans greatly increased the income of the temples, and the need to calculate interest rates led to another invention of Sumerian civilization: the advent of mathematics and fractional numbers. The priests were now not only the accountants of the communal wealth, but also the owners of their own vast capital, which further strengthened their influence. Gradually, the position of high priest ceased to be elective and became hereditary, and the high priests became the sole rulers of the communities. Now, the high priest was both a priest and a ruler, an organizer of public events and a leader of the army, since the temple squad was the regular military unit, and the councils of elders became merely advisory bodies. This happened about the turn of the 4th and the 3rd millennia BC. The introduction of grain loans gradually led to the ruin of many farmers. If the loan couldn't be repaid, the farmer borrower either lost his farm, which was alienated in favor of the temple, or had to work on the temple farm to repay the loan. Thus was born debt slavery and a large number of non-owners. They were willing to work for rations for the temple, and the temple itself gradually became a large landowner. The temples not only confined themselves to confiscating land for debts, but with huge financial resources began to buy land from the communities. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, they had become the largest landowners in southern Mesopotamia. Now, almost the land here belonged to the temples, and the former free members of communities turned into a mass of destitute people who worked for the temple for their rations. In addition, these people were very obedient because they could be deprived of their rations for any disobedience. Thus was born the Oriental despotism. But there was another question: what to do with the social tension, which was very high in such a society? The situation could explode at any moment, and destitute crowds would storm the temple and kill the priesthood. There was a need for a lightning rod that would be associated with the current government and would take on the wrath of people in case of revolt. The Lugal was chosen for this role. Once upon a time, back in communal times, this was the position of the elected military leader in the event of war. Now, through the efforts of the priests, the position of the Lugal was transformed into an absolute monarch, master of the state, and anointed of God. Now the Lugal, completely controlled by the priesthood, was the formal head of state and owner of everything. The priestly caste, which fully controlled the whole situation and continued to maintain its ruling position, was in the shadow, officially engaged only in philosophy and divine deeds. They were no longer in any way associated with the government. Thus, the practice of appointing former rulers arose, and the deep state was born. But beyond that, it was necessary to somehow extend their influence to the neighboring peoples. It wasn't possible to do this through the Lugals, the rulers of small states. It was necessary to use other means. And then, instead of small city-states, it was decided to create larger states with centralized, controlled power. The first such state became the Akkadian Kingdom in the 24th century BC, led by King Sargon. He militarily united the city-states and annexed many neighboring territories, creating the first empire in history. And the priestly caste retained the same position in this empire as it had in the Sumerian city-states. Then, in the 2nd millennium BC, even larger empires arose, like the Babylonian and Assyrian kingdoms. And in all of them, the real, invisible power was the priestly caste. At that time, these castes were called Chaldeans. At this point, we can say that the project of building a new type of society on the basis of the primitive community developed by the priestly caste has been fully realized. During the 2nd millennium BC, it went beyond the Middle East and began to spread around the world to other countries and peoples. I'll tell you about these events in the next programs. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss it. At this point, I wish to conclude this video. If it was interesting, leave comments, put likes and repost. Thank you for your attention. See you later. Goodbye.